There are stories in history that sound so improbable, so drenched in strangeness, that they blur the line between reality and delirium. Imagine a ruler seated on a throne of marble, the air around him heavy with incense and whispers, not feasting with courtiers or noblemen, but demanding that wild creatures share his table. Lions restrained by iron chains, birds fluttering nervously above golden platters, snakes coiled silently in bowls where fruit should have glistened. To some, this might sound like a grotesque hallucination, a fever dream born of excess, yet these were the habits of those crowned with power, rulers who treated the boundaries of reason as mere illusions to be bent and broken. It is here, in this twilight of sanity, that our journey begins, wandering through palaces where shadows echo louder than footsteps, where madness sits side by side with majesty. History remembers them not for their victories or reforms, but for the uncanny theater of their private lives, acts so bizarre that even the most elaborate fictions pale beside them. These monarchs did not simply command armies, they commanded reality itself, shaping it into grotesque spectacles that left witnesses doubting their own senses. The corridors of time are littered with such figures. A Roman emperor who believed oceans could be whipped into submission, punishing the tide as if it were a rebellious subject. A medieval king who demanded banquets served not with bread and wine, but with objects so unsuitable for the table that guests trembled, uncertain whether to laugh or weep. And then there were rulers who conversed with statues, whispering secrets to cold, unblinking eyes carved from stone, convinced that marble ears could hear their grand confessions. To step into their world is to let go of ordinary expectations. You will find no steady ground here, only shifting sands of obsession, where paranoia and eccentricity merge into spectacles so mesmerizing that centuries later they continue to haunt collective memory. Each tale is a crack in the mirror of reason, inviting you to peer inside, to glimpse what happens when unchecked power erodes the last fragile ties to reality. The first impression you may feel is disbelief. Could anyone truly behave this way? But disbelief dissolves quickly when records, letters, and chronicles align, whispering of nights illuminated not by candlelight but by the grotesque glow of madness parading itself as ceremony. Step closer, and you will sense the intoxicating aura of palaces where every hallway hides a secret, where every banquet becomes a stage for delusion. These halls are not silent. They resonate with echoes of orders barked to punish rivers, to elevate beasts above men, to twist faith into spectacle. Let your mind wander through these chambers without haste. Picture the velvet curtains heavy with dust, the walls painted with frescoes that watch silently as absurd rituals unfolded. Imagine the courtiers, torn between fear and fascination, compelled to applaud every extravagance, even as dread curdled in their veins. For them, loyalty was survival, but survival required submission to the wild theater their rulers staged day after day. There is no rhythm here that lulls you into calm repetition. Instead, every turn of history reveals a new distortion, a fresh descent into strangeness. The rulers you will encounter are bound by neither reason nor restraint. They are bound only by the fragile illusions they weave around themselves. Some believed storms could be bribed with offerings. Others thought eternity could be stolen through rituals drenched in absurdity. Each page of their story is a veil lifting, revealing a world so twisted and magnetic that you cannot help but keep watching. This is not a journey of kings and crowns as you know them. It is a plunge into the delirium of power, where each heartbeat of history trembles with eccentricity, cruelty, and unrelenting fascination. You will soon see how one ruler's obsession with punishing the sea was not an isolated madness, but a glimpse into a wider abyss of rulers whose minds spun realities stranger than dreams. As the chronicles unfold, one figure emerges like a phantom of excess, an emperor who gazed upon the vast sea and saw not a natural force, but a defiant enemy to be subdued. He ordered his legions to march to the shoreline, shields gleaming in the pale sun, banners fluttering in the salt-laden wind. Instead of preparing for conquest against distant lands, these soldiers received the command that froze their breath. The emperor, robed in imperial splendor, lifted his hand toward the roaring waves and demanded that the ocean be punished. Whips cracked against the surf, spears thrust into foamy crests, as though Poseidon himself might be humbled by the lash. The absurdity was so profound that silence swallowed the men, each one torn between obedience and the quiet terror of witnessing their leader unravel reason itself. It is in such moments that the thin veil separating majesty from madness dissolves. Imagine standing among those legions, the sting of salt water in your eyes, the cries of gulls circling above, and the surreal sight of disciplined warriors striking at tides that cared nothing for their fury. Did they question their emperor? They dared not. To question was to risk life itself, and so obedience cloaked their disbelief. Yet beneath the rigid discipline of their ranks, hearts must have raced with unease, for even the most loyal knew they were actors in a theater scripted by delusion. But the sea was not the only stage for this emperor's strange imagination. He collected seashells from the conquered shoreline, declaring them treasures of victory, tokens of a campaign against the unyielding ocean. Courtiers applauded, voices trembling, their claps echoing like hollow affirmations in the salt air. For the emperor, triumph lay not in logic but in spectacle, not in victories etched on maps but in dreams carved from fantasy. Such acts did not weaken his aura of power. Paradoxically, they amplified it. Madness, when wrapped in the robe of authority, commanded fear, and fear itself ensured obedience. What haunts us now is not the comedy of the scene, but the chilling recognition that power allowed delusion to thrive unchecked. A ruler's whim became reality, and reality bent beneath the weight of his imagination. History often describes empires as crumbling under the weight of invasions, famines, or betrayals. But here we glimpse another enemy, the corrosion of reason at the very heart of leadership. When a crown rests on the brow of one consumed by visions, every subject becomes a captive in the theater of the absurd. From the shores of the empire, the tale drifts inward, into palaces where gilded halls shimmered under torchlight, concealing shadows of other rulers equally consumed by eccentricity. One monarch, intoxicated by a hunger for eternal life, demanded feasts of strange ingredients, powdered gemstones, metallic dust, elixirs brewed from roots so toxic they burned the tongue. To the eyes of his followers, he was a seeker of immortality. To the whispers of servants, he was a specter dancing dangerously close to poison. His banquet tables gleamed with gold, yet the food upon them was often inedible, grotesque tokens of a mind wandering beyond reason. Guests sat trembling, unsure whether to mimic enjoyment or stare in silent horror as dishes arrived that defied the definition of sustenance. What was once a celebration of abundance became a grotesque ceremony, a masquerade of survival where each bite threatened to become the last. Still, voices rose in praise, for flattery was the only shield in a world where displeasing the sovereign could mean ruin. Such banquets linger not merely as curiosities but as warnings, reminders of how absolute power reshapes reality into a performance no one dares interrupt. The images almost dream-like: armies flogging seas, nobles choking on poisoned feasts, courtiers clapping with trembling hands. And yet, this is no dream. These stories linger in the annals of time because they are too strange to vanish, too haunting to be forgotten. The deeper you journey into this gallery of rulers, the more you sense the creeping unease of being drawn into a labyrinth where each turn reveals a spectacle more bizarre than the last. What lies ahead is darker still, for some sovereigns turn not only to eccentric rituals, but to cruelty masked as divine purpose, convincing themselves that their whims bore the weight of destiny. The corridors of history echo with rulers who blurred the boundary between eccentricity and cruelty, weaving rituals so elaborate that reality itself seemed to collapse beneath their weight. In one distant palace, a sovereign obsessed with his own reflection filled every chamber with mirrors, polished bronze, silvered glass, and crystal surfaces lined the walls so thoroughly that the ruler could never escape the sight of his own image. To him, this endless duplication was not vanity alone, but a form of divine affirmation, proof that his essence was multiplied infinitely, as though the universe itself acknowledged his supremacy. Servants moved carefully through these corridors of reflection, their faces fragmented into endless mosaics, while whispers filled the air, whispers of unease, whispers of dread. Visitors to this mirrored palace described the sensation as dizzying, a disorienting immersion into a dream where the sovereign's presence became inescapable. Even when he was absent, his gaze seemed to linger, refracted 1,000 times across polished surfaces. Meals were served under the watchful eyes of countless reflections, and music echoed strangely in the mirrored halls, reverberating as though the very walls were alive. To dine here was to step into a hallucination, a theater where reality dissolved into repetition, and the ruler stood at the center, basking in a multiplication of his own grandeur. But grandeur was never enough. This ruler, convinced that statues could act as intermediaries to gods, commanded sculptors to carve likenesses of himself in marble and bronze. Once installed, he held audiences with these statues, speaking to them in hushed tones, as if the cold stone harbored divine secrets. Courtiers stood silent, watching their king confide in his own effigies, fearing to question what their eyes witnessed. The statues never answered, of course, but silence was reinterpreted as divine approval, an echo of wisdom too sacred for mortal ears. Thus, delusion cloaked itself in ceremony, and ceremony transformed into unchallengeable truth. The deeper one ventures into such reigns, the more surreal the imagery becomes. Imagine the flicker of torchlight across marble faces, the heavy scent of incense thickening the air, and a sovereign whispering secrets to stone companions while the living stood mute. Each moment, each gesture carved into the memory of those who survived long enough to recall it. Centuries later, these recollections still feel like fragments of a fevered dream, yet they persist because their strangeness is too vivid to dismiss. Eccentricity, however, often hides a sharper edge. For some rulers, obsession bled into cruelty, and cruelty masqueraded as divine mandate. There was a monarch who demanded that his subjects address him not as king but as a living god. Temples once dedicated to deities were stripped of their idols and replaced with statues of his own likeness. Sacred rituals bent to his will, offerings once laid at the feet of immortal beings redirected toward the mortal man who now demanded eternal worship. Priests obeyed, their hymns reshaped into songs of praise for the crown, while citizens whispered their dismay only in the safety of darkness. The transformation of faith into spectacle left scars upon the land. To believe was no longer a choice but a duty, enforced by the gaze of soldiers who lingered in sanctuaries and marketplaces alike. The line between reverence and fear blurred until bowing became a reflex, and prayers turned into rehearsed affirmations. The monarch stood at the center of this theater of devotion, intoxicated by the sound of countless voices repeating his name in reverence, convinced that divinity had been transferred to his flesh. What fascinates and unsettles in equal measure is not merely the arrogance of such claims, but the willingness of entire populations to surrender their reason. In the silence of fear, delusion grows unchecked, swelling into myth that cloaks itself in authority. For those living beneath such reigns, the bizarre was no longer shocking. It was daily life, a constant reminder that power, once corrupted, reshapes reality itself. And so the chronicles march on, carrying us deeper into a world where thrones became altars to madness, where seashells counted as spoils of war, where reflections became companions, and where gods themselves were displaced by human vanity. The deeper you go, the more each story feels less like history and more like a dream unraveling, a dream from which no subject could awaken. In the annals of these haunted reigns, another figure emerges, remembered not for conquests or wise decrees, but for transforming his palace into a menagerie of dread. He commanded that wild beasts roam freely within the gilded halls, lions pacing between marble columns, leopards slinking across velvet carpets, bears chained to golden rings hammered into stone floors. At feasts, the roar of predators replaced music, and guests sat frozen, their smiles brittle, their laughter hollow. The sovereign delighted in their terror, interpreting wide eyes and trembling hands as tributes to his magnificence. To dine at his table was not merely to share a meal, but to submit oneself to a performance where survival became uncertain. The atmosphere within those walls was thick with the musk of beasts and the iron tang of fear. Servants moved quickly, their steps cautious, their breath shallow, balancing trays while avoiding claws and teeth that flashed in the torchlight. Musicians plucked trembling strings, each note swallowed by the growls of creatures too restless to be caged. The ruler, draped in silks and adorned with jewels, reclined upon his throne as though orchestrating a symphony of chaos, savoring each moment his guests flinched at the snap of a jaw or the swish of a tail. What began as spectacle soon twisted into ritual. He declared that the strength of his reign was bound to the ferocity of these beasts, that their presence affirmed his dominion not only over men, but over nature itself. He would stand among them, stroking their manes, as if to prove his immunity to danger, daring fate with every gesture. For the audience, the sight was mesmerizing, a sovereign bathed in torchlight, standing calm while a lion's breath stirred the folds of his robe. Yet beneath the awe lay dread, for power performed in such a manner demanded not admiration but surrender. Centuries later, chroniclers struggled to decide whether this was madness or method. Perhaps he sought to terrify his rivals into obedience, to remind them that their lives hung in the balance as precariously as theirs did during those feasts. Or perhaps he was enthralled by the illusion that he could merge with the primal, becoming a creature beyond the confines of humanity. Whatever the reason, the legacy endures, a palace transformed into a living nightmare, where banquets became tests of nerve, and survival itself was entertainment. But the spiral of strangeness did not stop at beasts. In another land, a ruler sought to bend time itself to his will. Obsessed with the idea of eternal daylight, he ordered his kingdom to live under a perpetual schedule of festivities. Night was abolished in decree. Lanterns and torches kept burning until exhaustion bent every back. Musicians played until their fingers bled, dancers twirled until they collapsed, and merchants were forced to keep stalls open through endless hours. To disobey the rhythm was to betray the sovereign's dream, and punishment was swift. Imagine walking through streets flooded with artificial light, where shadows never lengthened and silence was forbidden. The scent of smoke clung to the air, mingled with the sweet rot of food left too long upon open tables. Eyes bloodshot, bodies trembling with fatigue, the citizens moved like phantoms through this enforced celebration, their joy an empty mask. The ruler, however, believed he had achieved paradise, a kingdom that never slept, a carnival stretching endlessly toward eternity. This obsession with daylight was more than spectacle. It was a reshaping of reality itself. To deny the cycle of night and day was to declare war upon nature, to demand that even the cosmos obey a crown. Yet no command can hold back the creeping tide of exhaustion, and behind the walls of this perpetual festival, despair festered. Families collapsed into corners, seeking moments of rest in secret, praying not to be discovered. Their dreams were stolen, their nights erased, replaced by the ceaseless glare of lanterns. The chronicles of such reigns feel almost fevered, as though scribes themselves struggled to capture the surreal weight of events. Still, the stories remain, engraved into the memory of time. Palaces filled with beasts, cities drowned in false daylight, rulers wrapped in illusions that devoured their kingdoms. And as one tale closes, another always emerges, darker and stranger, drawing us deeper into the labyrinth where power and madness intertwine until they are indistinguishable. Among the strangest echoes of these monarchs lies the tale of a sovereign who viewed the boundary between life and death as nothing more than a curtain to be drawn aside at will. Obsessed with the notion of conquering mortality, he turned his palace into a vast laboratory of grotesque experiments. Alchemists, herbalists, and charlatans were summoned from every corner of the known world, bearing powders that shimmered like crushed stars, elixirs distilled from roots and fungi, and tinctures so bitter they scorched the tongue. Each night, as the moon hovered above the city, the ruler presided over ceremonies where goblets of these concoctions were raised like holy chalices. Servants trembled as he drank, convinced that they were witnessing the unveiling of immortality or the slow erosion of reason. The palace air was thick, with the acrid scent of boiling herbs, the clang of vessels upon fire, and the murmurs of incantations whispered by trembling alchemists, desperate to please. The ruler's body bore the toll of these pursuits, skin pale with strange hues, eyes fever bright, movements alternating between sluggishness and frantic bursts of energy. Yet in his delirium, he proclaimed these changes as proof of transformation, evidence that his blood carried within it the spark of eternity. Courtiers clapped dutifully, their palms raw from forced applause, while behind closed doors whispers spread like wildfire. The sovereign was poisoning himself in pursuit of a phantom. Still, the pursuit did not cease. Gardens once devoted to beauty were torn apart and replanted with strange flora brought from distant lands. Some leaves shimmered like emeralds beneath torchlight, others emitted odors sharp enough to sting the lungs. Pools were infused with minerals until their surfaces glowed unnaturally, and servants were ordered to bathe their ruler in these waters, as though each immersion washed away mortality itself. The effect on the kingdom was catastrophic. Treasuries drained, harvests neglected, artisans enslaved by impossible demands. Yet the sovereign pressed onward, convinced that death would falter before his relentless will. This obsession reached a crescendo during the construction of a colossal tomb that he declared would never serve its purpose. Built from stones so massive they seemed to defy gravity, carved with symbols meant to bind the soul within the body, it rose like a mountain above the capital. Citizens were forced to labor day and night, shaping an eternal house for a man who claimed eternity could never claim him. The irony seeped into every corner of the city, but none dared to voice it aloud. To do so was to risk vanishing into the shadowy prisons where dissent dissolved into silence. Walking through the streets beneath this looming monument, one might have felt the oppressive weight of both stone and illusion pressing down upon the people. Smoke curled from furnaces where metals were melted for new charms, and the clang of chisels rang through the night as the tomb grew higher, even as famine gnawed at the land. Mothers rocked hungry children while staring at the structure, blotting out the stars, wondering how much longer their bodies could endure. Yet still, when the sovereign appeared, gaunt but smiling with the certainty of a prophet, voices rose in hollow cheers. Survival demanded pretense, and pretense became the mask of every subject. The tragedy of such reigns lies not only in their futility, but in their hypnotic grip upon those who lived within them. Power twisted reality into theater, and subjects became unwilling actors, their lives scripted by whims they could not resist. The sovereign's pursuit of eternity ended, as all pursuits must, with death's unyielding hand, but the echo of his delusion survived, etched into the memory of his people, carried forward as a tale so strange it transcended time. And beyond his death, other stories rose, each stranger than the last monarchs who blurred the line between cruelty and spectacle, who treated their subjects not as citizens but as pieces in an elaborate game of fear. The labyrinth deepens, and with each step we take, the shadows grow heavier, the air thicker, the sense that we walk not through history but through a fever dream from which there is no waking. In another kingdom, far removed by geography yet bound by the same thread of delusion, a ruler became enthralled with the notion that silence was an enemy to be eradicated. He believed that quiet bred conspiracy, that whispers carried treason, and so he declared that sound itself must reign eternal within his borders. From dawn to dusk and through the endless night, drums thundered in the streets, horns blared at crossroads, and bells tolled with relentless insistence. Sleep became a luxury stolen in fleeting moments, as citizens endured an existence drowned in clamor. The city's atmosphere was suffocating, not with silence, but with the absence of it. Imagine narrow alleyways where torches flickered against stone, every surface vibrating under the assault of drums. Merchants shouted themselves hoarse, not to attract buyers, but to prove their loyalty to noise. Families covered their ears with cloth, children wept into pillows stuffed with rags, and even the animals grew restless, pacing ceaselessly under the barrage of sound. The sovereign, however, believed he had banished treachery, convinced that noise left no room for secrets to grow. Palace halls became chambers of orchestrated chaos. Musicians played without pause, their fingers bleeding against strings, lips cracked upon brass. Those who faltered were replaced instantly, for silence within those walls was a crime greater than theft or rebellion. Courtiers nodded along to the endless cacophony, their smiles stiff as though carved in wax, while exhaustion hollowed their eyes. The ruler himself walked among them like a conductor of madness, raising his hands to intensify the uproar, as if orchestrating a symphony that would echo across eternity. The deeper consequence of this obsession was far darker than frayed nerves. Without silence, thought itself began to fracture. Citizens found it difficult to concentrate, to dream, to remember the texture of stillness. Nightmares seeped into waking hours. Hallucinations born of fatigue painted shadows upon the walls. Murmurs of despair spread, but even those were drowned beneath the roar of drums. To imagine a moment of quiet became an act of rebellion, punishable by exile or worse. Thus, the kingdom became a prison of sound, every heartbeat drowned in relentless percussion. What fascinates and horrifies simultaneously is how quickly the unnatural became the norm. Generations grew within this kingdom, children who never knew the taste of silence, who believed the world was meant to thunder without pause. They danced to rhythms that were not celebratory but compulsory, their very steps bound to a decree that twisted life into perpetual performance. And yet, beneath this spectacle, despair deepened. The more the ruler demanded sound, the less the people spoke to one another, their voices lost in the storm. Communication dissolved, replaced by the hollow gestures of survival. When death finally claimed the sovereign, the bells continued to toll, for no one dared command their silence. Drummers still struck their instruments, though their hands trembled from fatigue, fearful of what would happen if the noise ceased. It was only days later, when exhaustion toppled entire regiments of musicians, that the first true silence returned. Witnesses described it not as peace but as terror, the absence of sound so alien that it pressed against their ears like a weight. People wept, not from grief, but from the unbearable strangeness of quietude. And thus silence itself became a ghost haunting the land, an echo of fear etched into every surviving soul. For years, even after freedom returned, citizens flinched at lulls in conversation, filling gaps with nervous laughter, terrified that quietude might summon the shadow of their former sovereign. Such was the legacy of a single obsession, an empire where reality had been reshaped until even silence became treason. From this tale we pass into another, where rulers, though different in their fixations, echoed the same truth, that unchecked power transforms human lives into stages for illusions, and illusions into prisons. Each chronicle adds another turn in the labyrinth, another wall of stone slick with the condensation of madness. And deeper still we go, for beyond noise and silence lie rulers whose strangeness was not confined to their kingdoms, but reached into the very bones of their subjects, altering the rhythm of daily existence in ways more grotesque than sound itself. Some rulers sought control not through spectacle alone, but through the reshaping of the body itself. In a kingdom where the boundaries of reason had already blurred, a sovereign declared that his people must reflect his vision of perfection. He He devised strange decrees about posture, appearance, and even the rhythm of breathing, insisting that citizens conform to his ideals. Streets were lined with guards who scrutinized every movement, ensuring that backs were straight, eyes lowered at the correct angle, and breaths drawn in unison during public ceremonies. To falter was to betray loyalty, and to betray loyalty was to court ruin. Imagine walking through a marketplace under such decrees. The usual chaos of bargaining, laughter, and quarrels was replaced by a strange harmony, a forced choreography of bodies moving in unnatural synchrony. Merchants arranged their goods with trembling precision, buyers gestured with measured restraint, and even children were compelled to practice regulated movements as though their very limbs belonged to the crown. The ruler watched from elevated balconies, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction as he beheld an entire population twisted into an unnatural reflection of his will. The deeper one looks, the more unsettling the details become. This obsession with control extended into meals, where citizens were ordered to chew in rhythm, to swallow in time with one another, as though the kingdom itself had become a single organism obeying one command. In feasts arranged within the palace, hundreds of guests sat shoulder to shoulder, their spoons lifted in unison, their cups tilted at identical moments. Servants monitored every gesture, ensuring no hand moved out of sequence. To be asynchronous was to risk the ruler's wrath, a punishment more terrifying than hunger itself. The sovereign believed this synchronization warded off chaos, convinced that disorder bred rebellion. He spoke of harmony as though it were salvation, though in truth it was a suffocating straitjacket. The people lived not as individuals, but as shadows stitched together into a singular performance. And yet, in the depths of their exhaustion, some began to feel their own selves dissolving, to move in constant imitation of others, to swallow and breathe in unison, was to forget where one person ended and another began. In this way, the ruler not only commanded obedience, but erased identity, reducing his subjects to fragments of a vast, silent machine. Over time, even the city itself was reshaped. Streets were widened so that crowds could march in perfect lines. Plazas remodeled into stages where synchronized rituals unfolded beneath the unblinking sunday. Musicians beat drums to mark the rhythm of daily life, while overseers cracked whips to enforce compliance. The air throbbed with a mechanical pulse, a living metronome imposed upon human existence. And within this carefully orchestrated nightmare, individuality withered like a plant deprived of light. Yet the ruler's obsession knew no end. He ordered towers built with mirrored panels, positioned so that he might look down upon his people and see their synchronized movements reflected back in endless repetition. He believed these images were proof of divine favor, that the gods themselves had blessed his choreography. Standing atop his towers, he stretched his arms toward the sky, as though commanding not only men but the cosmos itself to bend to his rhythm. The collapse came not from rebellion, but from the body's refusal to endure such tyranny. Exhaustion gnawed at the populace, malnutrition spread as eating became ritual instead of nourishment, and whole families collapsed in the streets, unable to maintain the ceaseless performance. Still, officials recorded these deaths as sacrifices to harmony, as if decay itself had been sanctified. The ruler remained blind to the unraveling of his world, cocooned in the belief that his symphony of bodies was eternal. This story lingers not simply because of its cruelty, but because of the hallucination it produced. An empire where people ceased to be people, where every gesture was scripted, every breath stolen by decree. It stands as a warning, etched in memory, a reminder that power unbound by reason reshapes humanity into a grotesque spectacle, until nothing remains but shadows dancing to a rhythm imposed by madness. Among the strangest echoes of these monarchs lies the tale of a sovereign who viewed the boundary between life and death as nothing more than a curtain to be drawn aside at will. Obsessed with the notion of conquering mortality, he turned his palace into a vast laboratory of grotesque experiments. Alchemists, herbalists, and charlatans were summoned from every corner of the known world, bearing powders that shimmered like crushed stars, elixirs distilled from roots and fungi, and tinctures so bitter they scorched the tongue. Each night, as the moon hovered above the city, the ruler presided over ceremonies where goblets of these concoctions were raised like holy chalices. Servants trembled as he drank, convinced that they were witnessing the unveiling of immortality or the slow erosion of reason. The palace air was thick, with the acrid scent of boiling herbs, the clang of vessels upon fire, and the murmurs of incantations whispered by trembling alchemists, desperate to please. The ruler's body bore the toll of these pursuits, skin pale with strange hues, eyes fever-bright, movements alternating between sluggishness and frantic bursts of energy. Yet in his delirium, he proclaimed these changes as proof of transformation, evidence that his blood carried within it the spark of eternity. Courtiers clapped dutifully, their palms raw from forced applause, while behind closed doors whispers spread like wildfire. The sovereign was poisoning himself in pursuit of a phantom. Still, the pursuit did not cease. Gardens once devoted to beauty were torn apart and replanted with strange flora brought from distant lands. Some leaves shimmered like emeralds beneath torchlight, others emitted odors sharp enough to sting the lungs. Pools were infused with minerals until their surfaces glowed unnaturally, and servants were ordered to bathe their ruler in these waters, as though each immersion washed away mortality itself. The effect on the kingdom was catastrophic. Treasuries drained, harvests neglected, artisans enslaved by impossible demands. Yet the sovereign pressed onward, convinced that death would falter before his relentless will. This obsession reached a crescendo during the construction of a colossal tomb that he declared would never serve its purpose. Built from stones so massive they seemed to defy gravity, carved with symbols meant to bind the soul within the body, it rose like a mountain above the capital. Citizens were forced to labor day and night, shaping an eternal house for a man who claimed eternity could never claim him. The irony seeped into every corner of the city, but none dared to voice it aloud. To do so was to risk vanishing into the shadowy prisons where dissent dissolved into silence. Walking through the streets beneath this looming monument, one might have felt the oppressive weight of both stone and illusion pressing down upon the people. Smoke curled from furnaces where metals were melted for new charms, and the clang of chisels rang through the night as the tomb grew higher, even as famine gnawed at the land. Mothers rocked hungry children while staring at the structure, blotting out the stars, wondering how much longer their bodies could endure. Yet still, when the sovereign appeared, gaunt but smiling with the certainty of a prophet, voices rose in hollow cheers. Survival demanded pretense, and pretense became the mask of every subject. The tragedy of such reigns lies not only in their futility, but in their hypnotic grip upon those who lived within them. Power twisted reality into theater, and subjects became unwilling actors, their lives scripted by whims they could not resist. The sovereign's pursuit of eternity ended, as all pursuits must, with death's unyielding hand, but the echo of his delusion survived, etched into the memory of his people, carried forward as a tale so strange it transcended time. And beyond his death, other stories rose, each stranger than the last monarchs who blurred the line between cruelty and spectacle, who treated their subjects not as citizens but as pieces in an elaborate game of fear. The labyrinth deepens, and with each step we take, the shadows grow heavier, the air thicker, the sense that we walk not through history but through a fever dream from which there is no waking. From the ruins of dread rises another tale, one where obsession took the shape of gluttony disguised as grandeur. This sovereign believed that meals were not for nourishment but for spectacle, that the act of eating could serve as a display of dominion. Banquets stretched for days, tables sagging under the weight of dishes so extravagant they blurred the line between sustenance and theater. Whole animals were roasted, their skins gilded with sheets of beaten gold. Fruits were dyed unnatural colors with crushed minerals, shimmering as though stolen from dreams. Wine flowed from fountains sculpted into grotesque faces, spilling endlessly onto marble floors. At first, courtiers marveled at the abundance, their eyes dazzled by the shimmering array of food, but awe quickly soured into unease. The ruler demanded that his guests consume not what pleased them, but what pleased him. Platters of inedible curiosities were forced upon them. Pastries filled with ashes, meats soaked in resins, loaves of bread hardened with dust of stone. To refuse was treason, and so they chewed with trembling jaws, swallowing shards of madness disguised as cuisine. Laughter, when it came, was brittle, masking the terror of choking not on food but on fear itself. The ruler himself feasted with ravenous delight, shoveling mouthfuls of bizarre creations while musicians played frenzied tunes in the background. Each bite became a proclamation of his superiority, proof that even poison could be turned into sustenance if consumed with the authority of a crown. Servants hovered, their eyes fixed on his every gesture, ready to applaud even as his lips stained with oils and metals glistened in the candlelight. He believed himself untouchable, immune to decay, transformed into something more than mortal through excess, yet the cost rippled through his realm. While the palace drowned in abundance, villages starved. Fields lay fallow as farmers were pressed into service, forced to supply not grain for the people but delicacies for the sovereign's endless feasts. Children cried for bread while ovens in the capital baked loaves of marble-hard offerings to decorate the banquets. The imbalance festered like a wound, each day deepening the chasm between ruler and ruled. Still, no voice dared rise above the din of music and hollow cheer, for to question the feast was to invite disappearance. The grotesque pageantry reached its peak when the ruler staged the banquet, in which no food was real. Tables were set with wax fruits polished to gleaming perfection, meats sculpted from clay, goblets filled with nothing but tinted water. Guests sat in stunned silence as the sovereign clapped his hands, demanding they pretend to eat, to chew air, and sip illusions. He watched with fever-bright eyes as nobles mimed their consumption, their faces pale with humiliation, their hands trembling as they lifted empty spoons to their lips. For him, the act was proof of power to force hunger into submission, to command even the body's most primal needs to obey his delusion. Historians later described this scene as a hallucination etched into reality, a nightmare masquerading as ritual. For the guests, it was more than theater. It was an initiation into despair, a reminder that reason had no place within those walls. Hunger gnawed at their bellies even as they clapped dutifully, praising the ruler's genius. And yet, within that grotesque performance, something shifted. The illusion cracked not in the ruler's mind but in the hearts of his people. Behind bowed heads and hollow eyes, resentment smoldered, waiting for the moment when fear would falter and the hunger for freedom would outweigh the fear of death. The sovereign never saw the change. To him, the banquet of illusions was triumph incarnate, proof that he could command not only armies and courtiers, but reality itself. He basked in the applause of trembling hands, blind to the silence gathering beyond his gilded halls. And so, another empire slipped further into the abyss, another chapter written in the book of madness, where feasts became funerals for reason and abundance rotted into the stench of ruin. Beyond the grotesque feasts of illusion, another tale unfolds: a ruler whose fixation was not food, nor beasts, nor silence, but the rewriting of time itself. He proclaimed that history, as it had been recorded, was a lie, and that only his vision could reshape the past. Chronicles were seized, scrolls burned, stone inscriptions defaced and recarved with his own exploits. In his kingdom, no story existed that did not bend to his narrative. He declared himself conqueror of lands he had never seen, victor of wars he had never fought, and the very origin of festivals that had existed centuries before his birth. Libraries were turned into workshops of deception. Scribes, trembling beneath the weight of expectation, labored day and night to erase truths and replace them with fantasies. Ink-stained hands redrew maps where borders bent unnaturally toward the capital. where rivers changed course to reflect his supposed triumphs. The sound of scratching quills became the rhythm of false eternity, every line of text another stitch in the cloak of delusion that enveloped the kingdom. To resist was to vanish into silence, one more name erased not only from records but from memory itself. The effect was dizzying. Citizens grew uncertain of their own pasts, their family histories rewritten to align with the sovereign's desires. Ancestors once celebrated for small acts of bravery were suddenly condemned as traitors, while others were elevated into heroes who had never drawn a blade. Even the rhythm of festivals became distorted, with rituals rebranded as homages to the ruler's supposed achievements. The very flow of time fractured under his will, and memory itself became a fragile illusion. To walk through the capital during this reign was to feel trapped within a living hallucination. Murals on walls showed the sovereign slaying beasts he had never encountered, towering over enemies he had never faced. Statues depicted him crowned with laurels of victory, even as famine hollowed the cheeks of his subjects. Songs were rewritten so that every note carried his name, and schoolchildren recited verses that declared him both founder and savior of the realm. The past no longer existed. Only his version remained, a reflection polished to gleaming perfection, hiding every shadow. The cruelty of this obsession lay not only in the erasure of truth, but in the suffocating weight of doubt it imposed. Citizens whispered questions in the dark. What was real? What was invented? Did their memories betray them, or had they always been mistaken? Generations born within the reign knew no other truth but his, and for them, history itself became indistinguishable from fiction. In this way, the ruler achieved something more insidious than conquest. He colonized the minds of his people, planting illusions so deep they took root as reality. And yet, the cracks appeared. Exiles who fled beyond the borders carried fragments of truth, preserving scraps of burned chronicles, smuggling tales whispered by survivors. These fragments clashed with the sovereign's narrative, and though his power silenced them within his land, they echoed beyond, carried on by travelers who spoke of a kingdom where time itself had been shackled to one man's ego. The outside world laughed at the absurdity, but for those trapped within, laughter was impossible. Their world was no longer their own. The ruler, however, reveled in his triumph. He stood in halls lined with rewritten histories, his own image painted in endless cycles, his name inscribed upon stones newly carved. To him, immortality had been achieved not through elixirs or monuments, but through the conquest of memory. He believed he had bent time to his will, convinced that as long as records bore his name, he would never truly die. But time is merciless, and lies, no matter how carefully crafted, decay faster than truth. When his reign ended, the palimpsests of deception crumbled, and beneath them, fragments of reality resurfaced like bones unearthed by restless soil. What endures is not his false glory, but the story of his obsession, a reminder that to rewrite history is not to control it, but to expose the fragility of power. And so, his legacy lingers not as the eternal conqueror he dreamed of, but as another shadow in the endless gallery of rulers who mistook delusion for destiny. From the ashes of rewritten chronicles rises another sovereign, one whose obsession was not with bending time but with dissolving the boundaries between the sacred and the profane. He declared that temples, once sanctuaries of gods, were now theaters for his own vision. Priests were forced to exchange hymns for chants of his name, and rituals, once whispered in reverence to the divine, became grotesque performances staged for his amusement. Altars glistened not with offerings of grain or incense, but with jewels pried from the hands of starving citizens, arranged in elaborate patterns meant to reflect his supposed radiance. The air inside these temples grew heavy, suffused with incense, burned in such excess that it choked the lungs. Candles flickered upon gilded statues not of gods but of the ruler himself, their hollow eyes staring blankly across congregations who bowed in fear more than faith. Every service became a charade, a ritual drained of meaning, yet enforced with iron severity. To abstain was heresy, to doubt was treason. And so, people prayed not to be heard but to survive, their lips moving with empty words, while their hearts recoiled in silence. Festivals once joyous were twisted into processions of despair. Dancers staggered beneath the weight of costumes plated with metal. Musicians played until their fingers bled, and crowds were compelled to shout the rulers' titles in unison, drowning out the last echoes of their forgotten gods. The sacred calendar fractured, its seasons reordered to align with the anniversaries of his birth, his coronation, his whims. Time itself became a shrine, not to eternity but to one fragile mortal consumed by delusion. The ruler's obsession reached its most grotesque form when he declared that dreams themselves belonged to him. Citizens were ordered to report their nightly visions to officials, who cataloged them as messages from the sovereign spirit. Dreams of joy were labeled as proof of his benevolence, while nightmares were twisted into accusations of rebellion. People awoke trembling, terrified not only of what they dreamed but of what it might mean. Sleep, once a refuge, became another arena of control, another space colonized by madness. For those who lived under such a reign, reality felt like an endless hallucination. Sacred places echoed with false hymns, streets pulsed with forced celebration, and even the private realm of thought dissolved beneath surveillance. Yet amid the suffocating dread, fragments of quiet resistance flickered. Families whispered ancient prayers in hidden rooms, carved symbols of forgotten gods into the undersides of tables, and preserved songs too dangerous to sing aloud. In these small rebellions, memory survived, fragile but unbroken. The sovereign believed himself eternal, convinced that by fusing sacred ritual with his own image, he had achieved divinity. But divinity born of fear rots quickly. When his reign ended, temples crumbled into ruins, incense smoke dissipated, and the echoes of his name faded into silence. What remained were the scars of a people forced to worship not gods, but the illusions of a man who mistook madness for holiness. If some rulers sought to dominate faith, others sought to dominate nature itself. Among the strangest was a sovereign who proclaimed himself master of the skies. He believed storms were not random, but personal insults hurled from the heavens, and he waged war against the weather with the full force of his court. When dark clouds gathered, soldiers rushed to the ramparts carrying drums and trumpets, raising a cacophony meant to frighten thunder back into silence. Arrows tipped with silver were loosed into the storm, and fires were lit along rooftops to intimidate lightning with the glow of false suns. At first, these spectacles amused the people, a carnival of futility where arrows fell harmlessly and flames sputtered against the rain. But amusement dissolved into unease when the ruler began punishing those he deemed responsible for the storm's persistence. Farmers were flogged for failed harvests, accused of inviting rain through negligence. Fishermen were exiled, blamed for angering the tides with their nets. Even children were dragged into ceremonies where they were forced to shout curses at the sky, their voices breaking beneath the absurdity of their task. Palace records describe nights when the ruler sat awake on his throne, his crown tilted, his eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness, convinced that clouds gathered deliberately to mock him. Courtiers, desperate to appease, presented him with jars of air captured from calm days, promising that releasing them would banish storms. He would inhale deeply from these vessels, proclaiming the scent of clear skies restored, even as thunder cracked outside. Servants clapped, soldiers cheered, and the charade continued, a kingdom held hostage by a man's quarrel with the elements. The obsession grew more elaborate. He built towers designed not for defense, but for confronting the heavens, structures tipped with iron rods where priests and generals alike gathered to chant commands at the storm. He paraded through the city cloaked in fabrics embroidered with suns, moons, and stars, proclaiming himself arbiter of celestial order. And when lightning inevitably struck these towers, setting them ablaze, He declared it proof of the sky's surrender, twisting calamity into triumph. The toll on his subjects was devastating. Fields flooded as farmers were too terrified to plant without official permission, waiting for decrees that aligned with his fantasies. Crops rotted, famine spread, and yet celebrations of victories against storms grew ever grander. Starving citizens painted smiles upon their faces during parades, chanting praise as rain poured down upon their hollowed cheeks. Hunger gnawed at them even as the ruler boasted of his conquests over thunder, blind to the ruin creeping across his land. What makes this tale linger is not only its absurdity, but its strange familiarity. To see men whip at waves or curse the sky is to glimpse the eternal human struggle against forces beyond control. Yet here, that struggle metastasized into tyranny, transforming fear of weather into a tool of domination. The ruler's madness infected every corner of his realm until nature itself seemed an accomplice in his cruelty. In the end, storms outlasted his reign. Towers crumbled, fires dimmed, and the air he claimed to command moved on without heed. His people, gaunt and weary, returned at last to planting, whispering prayers not to their sovereign but to the clouds he had once cursed. Time eroded the monuments of his obsession, but stories of his folly endured, whispered with equal parts horror and disbelief. And so another shadow joined the gallery of monarchs who mistook delusion for destiny, leaving behind not glory, but ruins haunted by laughter too bitter to fade. Among the strangest of rulers was one who declared war not against the sea or the sky, but against sleep itself. He believed slumber was weakness, a thief of time, an enemy of productivity. In his kingdom, nights became prisons of forced wakefulness, citizens ordered to labor, march, or sing through the dark hours. Torches burned endlessly in the streets, smoke hanging heavy in the air, casting distorted shadows that wavered like restless ghosts. Sleep was outlawed, rest treated as betrayal, and eyelids became battlegrounds where willpower and exhaustion waged their endless war. At first, people tried to obey. They stood in lines under flickering flames, chanting praises until their voices cracked, clapping their hands in hollow rhythm to drive away fatigue. Soldiers patrolled the streets, striking those who faltered, dragging the unconscious back to their feet. Families whispered prayers for strength, rocking children who sobbed from exhaustion, their tiny bodies trembling from the strain of endless wakefulness. The city became a theater of hollow eyes and shaking hands, every soul a puppet jerked about by the strings of madness. The sovereign himself prowled the palace halls at night, draped in robes stitched with suns and eyes, symbols of vigilance. He believed sleeplessness gave him visions, glimpses of eternity denied to ordinary mortals. Courtiers followed, their steps sluggish, their bodies wilting, yet forced to applaud each declaration of divine insight. In great halls, musicians plucked strings until their fingertips bled. Singers croaked notes until their voices collapsed, all in the service of keeping silence and therefore sleep at bay. The toll grew unbearable. Crops withered as farmers, too weary to tend their fields, collapsed beside their plows. Craftsmen produced weapons and tools so flawed they crumbled in their hands, their minds clouded by fatigue. Infants perished in cradles where mothers, half-conscious, could no longer rock them. And still the ruler proclaimed triumph, boasting that his realm had conquered the tyranny of slumber, that his people were warriors against dreams. Despair twisted into hallucination. Citizens began to see figures lurking in corners, hear whispers that never came from human lips, feel phantom touches along their skin. Streets echoed with laughter that had no source, and eyes burned with visions conjured by exhaustion. The kingdom dissolved into a waking nightmare, reality and dream bleeding together until neither could be distinguished. For the sovereign, this was proof of transcendence. He declared his people enlightened, their visions sacred revelations granted through endless wakefulness. For his subjects, it was torment without end. Historians who later chronicled these years spoke of entire villages lost to madness, communities wandering into forests in delirium, never to return. They described cities that reeked of smoke and sweat, streets littered with bodies too weary to rise. The sovereign, blind to decay, insisted his rule was eternal, convinced that sleeplessness had freed his people from mortality itself. He never noticed the hollow gazes that no longer saw him as divine, but as a phantom dragging them into the abyss. In the end, it was not rebellion that toppled him, but the inevitable collapse of flesh. His body, racked by years of sleeplessness, finally surrendered, though even in his final hours he raved of visions, declaring himself awake when death closed his eyes at last. His people buried him not with hymns, but with silence, collapsing into rest so deep it seemed the entire land sighed in unison. The story endures because it embodies the cruelty of obsession, to mistake exhaustion for enlightenment, to confuse hallucination with revelation. His reign left no monuments, no victories, only a memory of hollow-eyed citizens stumbling through endless nights, and the bitter lesson that even kings cannot escape the human need for dreams. If sleeplessness was one sovereign's obsession, another ruler's fixation was with shadows themselves. He proclaimed that light was deceit, that truth could only be found in darkness, and so he plunged his kingdom into a perpetual twilight of his own design. Windows were bricked over, torches extinguished, and mirrors smashed so that no glimmer might betray the purity of shadow. Streets, once alive with color, dulled into gray corridors, the sun reduced to rumor, the moon to myth. Children grew without memory of daylight, their eyes wide and glassy, accustomed only to dim lanterns that swayed weakly in the gloom. The ruler walked through these shrouded streets, cloaked in black silk embroidered with symbols of eclipse, his face veiled so that even his features dissolved into obscurity. He called himself guardian of truth, claiming the brightness of day-blinded men to reality, while darkness revealed all. Courtiers echoed his proclamations, though their voices trembled, for they too longed secretly for the warmth of light. Yet longing was treason, and treason was punished with swift and merciless severity. In palaces stripped of windows, the sovereign staged ceremonies of shadow. Candles burned low, casting faint silhouettes upon walls, and participants were ordered to bow not to idols or statues, but to their own flickering forms projected in dim glow. He declared these shadows eternal companions, reflections of the soul untainted by deceit. Families, fearful of punishment, gathered nightly to bow before the shapes their bodies cast upon floors, whispering hollow prayers to silhouettes that trembled with each movement. The air grew heavy with wax and smoke, the scent of confinement clinging to every breath. Over time, the absence of light reshaped the land. Crops withered in neglected fields, livestock stumbled in confusion, and birds abandoned the skies. Markets shrank into underground vaults where goods exchanged hands in half-light, merchants whispering prices as if afraid that sound itself might shatter the fragile twilight. Festivals that once bloomed with color became processions of black banners and muted drums, their melodies low and mournful, dissolving into the darkness like sighs swallowed by void. The people's bodies bore the mark of this reign. Skin turned pale, veins visible beneath thin flesh, eyes enlarged to capture what little glow remained. Dreams became strange, filled with landscapes of endless night, their visions indistinguishable from waking hours. Children played with shadows as though they were toys, chasing them across the floor, unaware that their world had been stripped of half its spectrum. What should have been joy was instead a distortion, laughter ringing hollow in a realm where color had been outlawed. Historians would later call it a kingdom of ghosts, a land where citizens drifted like phantoms through corridors of gray. For the ruler, however, it was triumph. He declared that darkness had purified his people, freed them from the distractions of light, anchored them to a truth only he could define. He believed the sun itself was defeated, conquered by decree, erased from memory by obedience. But nature is patient. Clouds parted, seasons shifted, and eventually the sun pierced through the cracks of ruined bricks and crumbling walls. Its warmth struck skin so pale it burned, its glow so foreign that people wept at the sight. For a moment, silence hung across the land, broken only by sobs of disbelief, for they had lived so long without light that its return felt like a miracle. The ruler, furious, commanded the people to close their eyes, to shun the sun as falsehood. Yet the more he demanded blindness, the more his subjects opened their gaze. In the end, it was not rebellion that destroyed him, but illumination itself. Light reclaimed the land, indifferent to decrees, indifferent to crowns. The sovereign retreated deeper into his palace, hiding in shadows until death took him. His people emerged, blinking into the dawn, scarred but alive, whispering prayers not to gods or kings, but to the rising sun that had outlasted all delusion. The gallery of strange rulers narrows toward its end, but the labyrinth saves one last tale, a sovereign consumed not by feasts, storms, or shadows, but by his reflection in death. He was obsessed with the moment when life would slip away, and he sought to stage it as though it were theater. He commanded that coffins be built not of wood but of crystal, so that his subjects could see their king preserved forever in a luminous shell. Around this coffin, he arranged rehearsals of his own funeral, summoning musicians to play mournful dirges, priests to chant laments, and citizens to march in black robes as if the ruler were already gone. He reclined upon the crystal bed, eyes closed, listening to the performance of his own demise, a spectator to the grief he demanded. These rehearsals repeated endlessly. Each week, the city was summoned into mourning, bells tolling as though death had arrived. Though the sovereign lived still, drinking in the spectacle, he watched from behind veils as his subjects wept, their tears sometimes genuine. For grief is difficult to counterfeit when despair already lingers. Children were taught to cry upon command, their voices rising in rehearsed wails. Merchants shuttered their stalls, processions halted daily life, and the kingdom itself became a stage where mourning never ceased. Within the palace, the obsession deepened. Servants were ordered to practice embalming with wax figures, to perfect the preservation of features, to ensure no blemish would mar their sovereign's eternal image. Perfumes and oils filled the air, mingling with the bitter tang of chemicals, until even breathing became a reminder of death. Mirrors were covered, not to banish vanity, but to prepare for the moment when his preserved face would become the only reflection allowed. He called this pursuit immortality through memory, a defiance of decay, though to his people it was an endless funeral that drained joy from every hour. The toll on the realm was catastrophic. Work halted, fields lay untended, and famine crept through the land while the sovereign rehearsed his departure. The people staggered beneath the weight of perpetual mourning, their lives measured not by harvest or festival, but by the rhythm of dirges. Even laughter became dangerous, for joy was treason in a kingdom where death ruled every street. The ruler never noticed their hollow eyes, their gaunt faces, their quiet prayers for release. He believed the weeping was worship, blind to the truth that it was exhaustion masquerading as grief. And yet, in a twist, almost too cruelly poetic, his final hour arrived not during one of his rehearsals, but in silence. Alone in his chamber, he collapsed upon the crystal coffin, his body striking the surface he had so lovingly prepared. There was no orchestra, no parade, no rehearsed lament, only the faint echo of his fall, muffled by stone walls. By the time servants discovered him, his breath had ceased, and the crystal bed he had built for eternity became his actual grave. The people, summoned once more to mourn, did not weep. Their eyes were dry, their hearts emptied of grief by years of endless rehearsal. Instead, they stood in silence, watching as his body was sealed inside the coffin he had adored, his face visible yet lifeless, a mirror of the futility that had consumed him. For the first time in generations, the bells tolled not his command but his closure. What remains of his reign is not glory nor reverence, but the image of a kingdom trapped in perpetual mourning, a stage where grief became law. His story, like those of the rulers before him, endures because it reveals the fragile thread between power and delusion. Each believed they had conquered time, death, nature, or truth. Yet in the end, storms raged, the sun returned, silence fell, and death claimed its due. The labyrinth closes, but its echoes linger. We emerge from the shadows of madness with the uneasy recognition that history is not merely the record of victories and crowns, but of illusions so powerful they reshaped entire worlds. These tales remain because they are unforgettable, because they blur the line between hallucination and reality, because they remind us that power without restraint transforms men into phantoms and kingdoms into dreams from which waking comes too late.